Welcome to the Soulcery Podcast, your sacred space to delve into spiritual tools, topics, and practices that will illuminate your path of soul remembering and healing. I'm your host, Ligia Costa, a soul guide, alchemist, soul writing coach, and the creator of the Trust Pathway. I'm deeply grateful to have you here with me. Together, we'll embark on a profound exploration of self-discovery and healing, unlocking the secrets that lie within. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Soulcery Podcast. I'm Ligia, and today we are diving into something that has been on my mind lately. And it's about this fascinating concept that touches not just our individual healing journeys, but how we as souls are influenced by something far larger than ourselves. And that is group energies, the collective energies. This conversation is one that touches on ancestral trauma, on epigenetics, on attachment theory, and at its core, how the need to belong often disconnects us from our true essence. So the other day, I came across some really thought-provoking insights from Ra Uru Hu, who is the creator of human design. And he introduced me to this idea of pentas. Now, pentas is referred, and according to Ra, is referred to group energies. How we as human beings are not just solitary beings, just individual beings, but we are deeply influenced by the dynamics of the groups we belong to. Think about your family, your social circles, your friendship circles, or even your workplace, right? When we step into these groups, normally what happens is that the decisions that we make, or the thoughts that we hold, and even the way that we behave are often influenced by the collective energy of that group rather than our own individual truth. And we might think that we have some sort of authority, right? Some sort of independency, and that we are making decisions or we are having our own thoughts. But in reality is that deep down we are being influenced on an energetic level by the group dynamics, by the group we are in. But what struck me the most was Ra Uru Hu's suggestion that this group influence isn't just something that we experience by chance. And this is when I had this huge light bulb moment. According to him, it's genetically ingrained in us. He suggested that our genetic makeup, per se, drives us to form families and other social units. But these formations can also create tension and conflict, especially when they don't align perfectly with our individual desires or needs. And because I had this huge breakthrough and I start pondering and thinking about, his theory around how we are genetically influenced by the collective energy, this got me thinking deeply about our own unconscious behaviors and how these genetic choices that we make due to our human need to be social and to belong and survive can also be linked with trauma or can lead to trauma, such as ancestral trauma and epigenetics. So if you think about it, we are driven to form families and social units and tribes because it's essential for our survival. that's why we kind of want to be part of our local community, being it, church, being it the PTA group in our children's school, being a local yoga group or walking group. Even if we go outside and we walk our dogs, there is always, the neighbors or someone in the local area that meet up in a local park or something. And even online, we normally join groups that share the same interests, the same energy, or the same struggles, because we have this deep human need to belong. And yet, this very drive, the one that pushes us to belong to a group, to a community, to a tribe, to a family, can also be the source of much tension and conflict and ultimately trauma. So if you think about it, how often do we sacrifice our individuality in order to fit in, right? How often do we push down our true selves, our desires, our needs, because we fear rejection or disconnection from the people around us, not being understood if we voice our needs and our emotions, right? This genetic drive to survive through belonging can lead to what I normally called a disconnection from our soul essence. And it is this disconnect that sits at the heart of so much trauma that we experience in life. Not just in our lifetime, but generationally. And this is when things get really interesting. So, ancestral trauma is real. Is the unresolved pain, the suppressed emotions, and the coping mechanisms that were passed down through generations and generations that live within us. And sometimes this manifests in subtle ways. For example, things that we fear and we have no recollection why we fear those things, right? The beliefs we hold about ourselves or the way we relate to others. But other times, it can be more explicit. For instance, patterns of abuse, emotional neglect, limiting social expectations that shape entire family systems, sexual abuse. These are not just personal experience, and this is very important to remember. These are echoes from the past. This comes from generations and generations, up to 7 generations before us. And this goes even deeper when we consider epigenetics. And I'm loving this conversation because all of these just feeds my passion for researching and for connecting the dots. And I'm absolutely loving, sharing this with you. So, epigenetics is the study of how an environment or how some experiences in our life, particularly traumatic ones, can change the way our genes express themselves. So, the traumas your grandparents or your great-grandparents faced, they may have altered their own biology in a way that impacts you today. And this is what we talk about when we talk about ancestral trauma. Because you can think about ancestral trauma as a very spiritual way of thinking how karma or karmic wounds are passed on through generations and generations. But if you look at science, it has been proved through epigenetics that this actually happens. That ancestral trauma is basically the biology in our grandparents and great-grandparents, our ancestors basically, that changed at some point due to an individual or a collective trauma. And then because their DNA changed, it changed the DNA of your parents and therefore your DNA. And this is how trauma is passed on from generations to generations. So if we go back again to our grandparents and great-grandparents, the stress and fear and survival mechanisms from their time could stem from social expectations, can come from survival struggles, or even family dynamics that forced our ancestors into challenging circumstances, into going into this very deep survival mode, which we know affects our bodies. And over time, this inherent pain creates these cycles of trauma that shape how we behave and how we respond to life. And this is often very unconsciously. We have no conscious awareness of this happening. If we go back to Ruhu's theory on group dynamics, or pentas as they call it, and how it can shape us, this epigenetics and generational trauma echoes this, right? For instance, his description of the genetic pull towards certain relationships or family configurations can create an environment where individuals may feel limited or disconnected from their core selves. And this disconnect can trigger a sense of being powerless or inner conflict, which can then manifest as trauma. And when we fail to align with our authentic selves in these group dynamics, it creates a cycle where each generation passes on not just the typical traits, but also the emotional and physiological and psychological imprints from the unresolved ancestral pain. And this is so mind-blowing to think about, because we think we choose our group dynamics, our friends, our families, or extended family, our romantic partners, our work colleagues. We think we choose this consciously, but we are being influenced on such a deeper level that we have no conscious awareness of. And having studied and been certified as trauma-informed coach, I can see so clearly how this human predisposition to genetically be driven to belong and to survive can lead to unhealthy relationship attachments, which in turn explains so much about our trauma responses, how we respond to trauma, to triggers. So when I was studying about trauma and I was taking my certification, I learned about John Bowlby's work on attachment theory. And attachment theory highlights how our earliest experiences with our caregivers shape our emotional bonds and how we relate to others throughout our life. So, if our need for security, our need for belonging and for survival, which is a human need, we are born like this, right? If these need for security and belonging and survival is driven by our genetic wiring, if this is not met in a healthy way by our caregivers, it can lead to attachment wounds. So these wounds in turn form the basis on how we react to relationships and to stressful experiences throughout our lives. I hope you can see how I see all these dots connecting. Is so amazing. But let me explain a bit more about the attachment theory. So our genetic programming, right, pushes us to seek connection and safety and belonging. We already clear that. But when our caregivers, our parents, our grandparents, or those who raised us, when they don't meet these needs consistently, we develop what's known as attachment wounds. And this is where things get really interesting. Some of us may develop an anxious attachment style. And this is me. If you heard the podcast before, I shared many times that I am a survivor of childhood abuse. So my mother never consistently, in a healthy way, met my need for safety and belonging. And so since a very young age, I suffer from chronic anxiety. So I have this anxious attachment style, which as an adult, then it translates in constantly seeking reassurance, constantly seeking validation and closeness. And we tend to cling to others because we fear abandonment. Now, other people might develop an avoidant attachment. And this is where we learn to suppress our emotional needs. This is when we become emotionally distant, self-reliant, and very detached from our own vulnerability. And for some, especially to those that experience trauma and abuse early on, there is a disorganized attachment, which I also have. We all kind of jump from one attachment style to another, depending on the cycles we are in life, depending on the healing work we are doing in ourselves. But it's very common to jump from one to another. For instance, when I lost my dad, I was in this very avoidant attachment style. I was very emotionally distant. I was only just, on myself. I was suppressing my emotional needs, which I'm still paying for, because to cover that up, to hide that, I put a lot of weight, and I'm still fighting to shed that weight that served as a protection mechanism. Coming back to the disorganized attachment, this is where we both crave and fear connection. This is when we oscillate between pushing people away and pulling them in. It's basically being in the middle of anxious attachment style and a distant or avoidant attachment. This is where we are there in the middle. And the thing is, these attachment wounds don't just sit there quietly in our relationships. They drive our trauma responses. This is what happens when we get triggered and we don't realize why my partner is saying this. That is nothing related with anything I went through with him, but all of a sudden, your deepest wounds from your childhood get triggered. And this is also why we normally choose partners or are drawn to partners who mirror the carer in our life, which was unable to meet our emotional needs. And we are trying to, in a very unconscious way, relieve that and try to change what happened and seek in the other person what we lacked as a child. And that's why we see so many toxic relationships, because then people with anxious attachment style, which normally clings on to a partner with fear of being abandoned, is often attracted to an avoidant attachment style partner who basically is suppressing their emotional needs and are emotional distant. So they can't meet the anxious attachment style person. And basically that person, they are both reliving the same traumas and the same wounds, seeking on the partner to fill that gap, to fill that hole in their soul, to fill that lack of emotional need they had as children. And then the relationship becomes very toxic and can create codependency and other issues in relationships. And that's why I'm saying these attachment wounds don't sit quietly. They affect our relationships. They drive our trauma responses. And when we hear terms like fight, flight, and freeze or fawn responses, these are the ways we protect ourselves from the deep-rooted fear of disconnection, of not belonging, because then it means that we are not safe. So, for instance, the anxious person may fawn, right? They might try to please everyone, while the avoidant person might flight by emotionally withdrawing. And this is all just an effort to survive. It's just a cry for help. It's a way to avoid the pain of being disconnected from others, and often from ourselves too, because we've been suppressing who we are. Even when we do our inner work, our healing work, and we think, and this is going back to the beginning of this conversation, we think that we are choosing our circles, our pentas, our groups consciously, but we are still deep down and unconsciously being influenced by the collective, by all these traumas and these attachment wounds that through epigenetics, through ancestral generational trauma are passed down to us. And an example of this is, for instance, if your parents or your grandparents were in survival mode due to war, due to poverty, or their own unresolved trauma, they might have formed insecure attachments that then were passed on to you. This is not just a learned behavior, and this is really important to understand. This is in our genetics. This is echoed in us, both biologically and emotionally. And this genetic drive for connection and for belonging can lead us to disconnect from our true essence, from our authenticity, from our individuality, making us more vulnerable to then be influenced by the group energies, by the penta, right? So when our sense of security and survival depends so heavily on fitting in or maintaining these very unhealthy attachments that we just talked about, we often suppress our authentic selves in order to be accepted, in order to be loved, in order to feel safe within a group, whether it's a family group, a social circle, a friendship group, or even societal structures. And when we suppress our true self to fit it into group dynamics or uphold attachment patterns, what happens is that we might feel unfulfilled, disempowered, trapped. And this often results in feelings of anxiety, depression, unresolved emotional pain, mental health issues, because we continue to repeat these patterns over and over again. And then we end up passing these disconnections and these wounds down through generations, through epigenetics, reinforcing that cycle of collective and ancestral trauma. I hope this makes sense, and I hope you don't feel disheartened, even though we are genetically predisposed to all of this and subject to all of this. I want to bring you some hope, okay? Even though we might have inherited these wounds, even though we are influenced by group energies and ancestral trauma and different attachment styles due to our childhood wounds, we also have the power to heal. And this is down to each one of us. And you start to do that work when we start understanding these attachment patterns, when we start recognizing the unconscious ways in which group energies influence us. And when we do that, we can begin to break free from the cycles of trauma. We can start to reconnect with our essence, with our true self, with the part of us that knows who we are. Okay, who we are beneath all the expectations and roles that we play in life. But healing requires to take an honest look at the ways we have suppressed our own individuality in order to belong. It is about asking ourselves, am I living in alignment with my truth? Or am I living according to what my family or my social circles or society expects of me? Am I acting out of fear or trust? Am I holding on to relationships, beliefs, or behaviors that no longer serve my highest good? Just take these soul inquiries in and be honest with yourself. Be really honest with yourself. That's how you start healing. And also I wanted to understand that we are not powerless to these dynamics, okay? Because when we have the awareness and through the healing work that we do, we can break the cycle. We can shift from living in fear of disconnection of not belonging to embracing relationships that really support us in becoming more of who we truly are. So, as you listen to this conversation today, take a moment to reflect on the group energies in your life. What pentas are you part of? And how are they influencing you? Are they helping you grow into your authentic self? Or are they pulling you away from it? And don't feel discouraged. I don't want you to go away from this conversation and think, okay, so I'm in this group or friendship group or this family group, and I've noticed that whenever I'm with this group of people, all the healing work I did goes out of the window. I go back to my old ways and then I hate myself for it. And I'm saying this because it happened to me, right? I've been doing so much work on myself and I feel like I'm moving forward, and then all it takes is me being on a family gathering with certain family members or going back to a family group, connecting back to a family group, and then my old me comes back, and then I end up either gossiping, which is something that I really dislike and I'm not open to it. But then because you are being influenced by the group energies, and this goes back to the whole conversation we had today, it's unconscious. And you just like that need to belong, that need to, connect with people. You kind of, if 2 or 3 people are gossiping, you just kind of join the conversation. This is just an example, okay? Or the way that you then come out of, the gathering or the event or whatever, and you feel drained and you feel like, oh my gosh, I did all of this healing work. Why am I still being triggered by what so-and-so said? I don't want you to come out of this conversation and think that you have to avoid this altogether. That's not the point, okay? And actually, it's very interesting when we go back into these interactions and we notice in ourselves and we have this awareness of ourselves going back into the shadow aspects that we've been healing and trying to accept and see what actually is coming up, and seeing how these interactions are mirroring something to us that we don't want to admit, but it happens. So instead of taking that awareness with judgment and shame and frustration, is really just to be open to what is trying to teach you. Why am I still getting triggered? Why is this shadow aspect of myself coming up again? Why this happens with this group of people? And when I'm away, I feel better. But obviously, it's also a call to not avoid this entirely. And there are some group dynamics and family dynamics that you can't really avoid. Think about Christmas, think about funerals, think about weddings. You know that you're going to be with that group of people. Is when you have this awareness of what it gets triggered, what lessons you normally have, why you react in certain ways, why your attachment wounds come up, what triggers and wounds come up when you are within this penta, is taking steps before and after to reassess, to protect yourself. It's not about avoiding everything. Otherwise, you're going into the avoidant attachment style, and there is no teaching, no growth when you are in there, because you're just closed off to anything. Just to be open, obviously, and being aware if you're going through a very difficult emotional cycle in your life, and by being around a certain penta, a certain group dynamic just brings out the worst in you, and you will feel much worse after you've been with them. It's just you protecting yourself and communicating a boundary there, and saying no to invites that are not going to be good for your well-being. But if you are well emotionally and there are interactions that you can't really avoid, it's just creating those protections, those boundaries before, creating space after to reassess, to rest, to recharge, and really trying to understand what are the learnings there, what these situations, these interactions are projecting and mirroring to you. That basically is just how your inner world is and is being projected onto these relationships and these group dynamics that needs further healing. Because ultimately, the journey of healing is about returning to your essence. And having this awareness, it's knowing who you are in your essence, when you are with yourself and when you are in a collective environment. And in doing so, you create a new legacy. Not one of trauma, but one of truth and alignment. Okay? Before I love you and leave you, I will pull a card from my Trust journaling deck. And the card that I pulled is from the Unravel suite. And the soul inquiry is, what's in my heart's true desire? Am I living it in my current reality? What is in my heart's true desire? Am I living it in my current reality? And the affirmation is, I trust that I am on the right path. Thank you so much for joining me today on this episode. I hope it brought you so much fire in your belly like it did to me. I absolutely loved this conversation because it just fuels my interest in history and how psychology and spirituality work together and how we come to be who we are as human beings. And it comes down to understanding why we behave in certain ways, why we make the choices that we make, why we struggle with certain things and not others, and how relationships are coming to our lives based on the cycles we are in our lives. So I really, really hope you have enjoyed this episode. If you did, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. It really helps the podcast to be seen and heard to those that really need to hear about this medicine, to hear about the things that I share that help people on their self-healing journeys. If you're listening on YouTube, again, give it a thumbs up, share the episode, subscribe to the channel. That will be very, very helpful. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you on the next one. Thank you for listening to the Soulcery Podcast and for holding space for this conversation. It is truly magical to be able to walk with you on this journey of soul healing and inner transformation. If you resonated with this episode and found it valuable, I would be grateful if you could leave a review on iTunes. Your feedback helps me reach more souls searching for guidance and healing. For more guidance and soul wisdom to support soul awakening women through the journey of alchemy, please visit my website www.ligiacosta.co.uk. Love and healing to all. See you on the next one.